Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're having a look at the body in motion and in particular force. When we look at the concept of force in a biomechanics term, it's the push or pull that acts against a body. We need to look at two concepts with forces. We have applied forces, which are generated by our muscles working on joints in the body, and then we have reaction forces, which are equal and opposite forces that are exerted in response to the applied forces. So, for example, our quadriceps and our calf muscles pushing down to the ground obviously is going to have an external force, which is a reactive force pushing up against the body to allow us to jump up. Let's have a look at the concept of how our body applies force. And quite simply put, athletes are able to apply forces to objects such as the ground or even the swimming pool, or running track, to allow them to run faster, move faster, etc. We can also apply forces to implements such as a tennis racket to enable us to hit the ball harder or faster. In doing this, an athlete is confronted with opposing forces such as gravity, air resistance, and friction. Like we have applied and reactive forces, we also have internal or external forces. So we look at the internal forces, are the ones that develop within the body, so contractions of our muscles, causing a joint angle to increase or decrease. And then we have external forces, which come from outside the body, that act in one way or another. For example, gravity is an external force that acts to prevent objects from leaving the ground. So when we have a look at the athlete here, he's obviously jumping up. Now, in the down phase of his movement, he's obviously applying an internal force downwards into the ground, and that's the applied force. We then see an external force, so the reactive forces happening for him to enable to jump up off the ground. We see these external forces go up, which is actually what we call a reactive force. So that's reactive force is actually the ground, and it's posing an equal force to what the force the athlete is pushing down with his muscles. We see the application of force in pretty much all physical activity. And it's sort of hard to think of sport without force being applied. If we think about sports like cricket or basketball or even a high jumper, imagine a player exerting a force with movement, but they're not having anything to push off against, say, the ground, and then they would just be sort of hanging on the ground, or they'd be suspended in the air if they didn't have gravity to bring them back down again. So it's really important to understand that there are lots of forces going into play when we are looking at sports and biomechanics. The next concept we're going to have a look at is how does the body absorb force when we're doing physical activity? And when we look at power biomechanics, we look at the concept of the ability of our muscle groups to contract at speed. So how fast can we contract our muscles to be able to take on force, to exert force, and to absorb forces? For most sports, the forces exerted on the body, so external or internal forces, are absorbed through our joints, so our knees, elbows, shoulders, hips, ankles, etc. And obviously we bend or we flex these joints in response to impact. In sports such as mountain biking, you'll notice that obviously the bikes have suspension in them to try and decrease the effects on the body, and also to provide for a much more safer ride. So it's also absorbing the force. So when we land on the floor, you'll see here when the athlete takes off, and then when they land, there's quite a lot of force coming from the body that's actually going into the ground. And when we remember, we go to reactive forces. So when we hit the ground is applying as much, if not more, force straight back into us. So if our body's applying force downwards, the ground is going to apply exactly that same amount of force back up. And hence why we really need to bend our knees to allow our body to soften that landing. If we landed with straight legs, there's a high possibility of sustaining injury, dislocation, ligament tendon tears, because our body has had full force put straight back into it. When we look at how the body absorbs forces, it's also important to have a look at how we absorb force from an implement. So, for example, when we're catching a ball, and if we were to catch the ball and leave our hands in exactly the same position and that ball was coming at us at quite some force, just like if we were to hit the ground with our feet, that ball will come quite hard and it's going to apply that same force to our hand, and you'll notice that when you catch quite a fast cricket ball, it stings. The reason it stings our hands is because the force of the ball has not been absorbed effectively by the athlete, and the impact felt by an object being caught is a product of the force of the ball, the distance through which the hands move while receiving the ball, and obviously the speed at which that ball is coming. Now, often a way that we remove force from a ball is to catch the arm outstretched and then move the arm back into the body. We can sometimes use two hands to decrease that force, and also moving the body during the action. So you'll often see sometimes baseballers pull the ball in and then pivot their body to take some of the force off the ball. The final concept when exploring forces in biomechanics is how do we apply force to an object. So, for example, here we've got the rugby player kicking a ball, or we've got a golfer hitting a golf ball. When we look at the concept of applying force to an object, there's a few things that we need to take in consideration. Firstly, how much of force is applied to that object is quite important. The greater the force that we have that we apply to that, the greater acceleration of the object is going to happen. So obviously when we look at a rugby union player, a small player whose mass and technique only allows for a small amount of force to be applied to that ball, means that the ball is not going to travel as far as, say, a first grade rugby player who is able to kick the ball a lot harder with a lot more force and a lot more speed, which allow the ball to accelerate faster and further. When looking at the concept of applying force to an object, if the mass of the force increases, so for example a rugby ball or a soccer ball becomes wet, then more force must be applied by the athlete to get the object to go the same amount of distance. This is obviously the same if the size of the implement increases. So for example, this is why younger athletes will use a smaller size ball than what older or senior athletes will use, because less force is required for that ball to be moved. When we look at sports such as golf, we look at the fact that there's two different types of forces happening here for the golf ball to be propelled quite far. We look at centripetal force, and it's a force that's directed towards the centre of a rotating body, and centrifugal force, which is a force directed away from the centre of the body. And when the golfer tries to hit the golf ball, both of these forces are experienced. And basically what happens is it allows the body to rotate, and because we can rotate the body, we actually get a lot more power and force coming through to hit the ball, which allows the ball to go further. So for example, if you're comparing a pro golfer compared to a beginner golfer, their rotation is obviously going to be a lot greater and a lot smoother than what a beginner golfer is, therefore allowing more force to be applied through the ball, allowing the ball to go much further on a drive. When we're looking at applying and managing centripetal and centrifugal forces, it's important to begin carefully so that you learn to feel the forces as they develop, so that you're not over-rotating or rotating out of position. Obviously, respond gradually, so work on that rotation in small increments rather than one small rotation to a large rotation. Obviously, we're working on balance and looking at the grip of the object, as well as bending our knees and elbows to allow for the force to be responded through those joints. So wrapping up here with our body in motion forces video, it's important for us to understand that when we look at forces, we understand how the body applies force to both internally and externally, how our body absorbs forces, and also how our body applies force to an object.